by another redeployed unit on the 1st of April. These units have contributed to stabilizing the security situation. Although the trigger for the uptick in violence in the three-border area seems linked to local trafficking and related activities, I would point out that these incidents are occurring in the context of the withdrawal of the Barkhane and Takuba forces. So since they are facing less pressure, the terrorist groups have greater capacity for action, posing an increased danger to civilians as well as to our operations. In the face of these challenges, it's imperative that the level of our capacity and our troops be maintained. It's also important that adequate responses be found to the challenges that we face in insufficient capacity and also the national restrictions or caveats of the police contributing countries.
Malian authorities to this council during its October visit, the Malian forces have stepped up their counter-terrorist efforts in the center to break the chokehold of extremist groups over large swaths of the region. While it is still too early to assess their long-term impact, these operations appear to have contributed to a decrease in armed clashes between community defense forces and terrorist groups, vehicle hijacking, abductions, and attacks on people's livelihoods and local infrastructure. Last week, Fama offensive against Katiba Masina, elements in Moura village, south of Mukti, falls within the scope of these operations. In a communique issued on 1st April, the Fama asserted that they had neutralized scores of terrorist elements controlling the area. At the same time, MINUSMA also received reports of serious human rights abuses committed against large numbers of civilians during this operation. The mission sought access to the area and was able to conduct a reconnaissance of a flight on 3 April. Authorization for the fielding of an integrated mission has until now not been issued. We are pursuing our extensive engagement with the national authorities to resolve this problem. While the announcement yesterday night by the prosecutor of the Mukti Military Tribunal of the opening of an investigation, including the deployment to the field of the required personnel, is a welcome initiative, it is also imperative that the Malian authorities extend the necessary cooperation for MINUSMA to have access to the site of the alleged violations in line with its mandate. More generally, on human rights, MINUSMA has opened 17 investigations on allegations of indiscriminate attacks against civilians, extrajudicial arrest, mistreatment, forced displacement, and extrajudicial killings in central Mali since the beginning of this year. We are currently finalizing an update on the human rights situation, which will cover the period from January to March of this year. Mr. President, while military and security operations are an absolute necessity in combating terror, experience has time and again shown that such an approach cannot on its own bring about lasting stability, especially in an environment as complex as the one prevailing in central Mali. First, these operations need to be conducted in ways that minimize to the full extent possible civilian harm and uphold human rights and international humanitarian law principles. Second, these operations have to be complemented by practical and sustained steps focusing on the root causes of conflict and violence. In this respect, the finalization by the Malian government of its strategy for the center and its effective implementation are a must for the stabilization of the region. In the meantime, MINUSMA continues to carry out important tasks linked to the protection of civilians, as in Ogosagu and along the Douenza-Petaka road in the central part of Mali, the protection of physical infrastructure and related livelihoods in the strategic axis linking Sevari to Bandiagara and local reconciliation agreements. In the same vein, we have recently launched a pilot project in the Douentza region to improve relations between the Malian defense and security forces and local communities. Mr. President, during the period under review, no tangible progress was made in the peace process, a situation that was compounded by the fact that the Agreement Monitoring Committee has not met since October last year, depriving the parties and their international partners alike of the much-needed platform to collectively assess the challenges at hand and seek a consensual way forward. Instead, the past 3 months were marked by worried actions and rhetoric, not in line with the spirit of the agreement. Furthermore, and in spite of the efforts made, tensions remain between the government and the signatory movements over the issue of the CAD strategic permanent, the structure put in place by the movements with the stated objective of reconciling northern communities. Against this backdrop, the mission, in coordination with Algeria, as the chef de file of the international mediation, has continued to engage the parties, encouraging them to move forward with the long-delayed high-level decision-making meeting expected to facilitate consensus on the critically important matters of global DDR and institutional reforms. I note that the government has shared with the signatory movements the draft terms of reference for the meeting. The current status quo carries huge risk for the future of the peace agreement and deprives local populations of the peace dividend they are yearning for, while also increasing the threats facing our peacekeepers deployed in northern Mali, especially in locations such as Kidal, Aguelhok, and Tessali. In this context, this Council may wish to urge the parties to take advantage of the synergies that exist between the recommendations of the Assise Nationale de la Fondation and the peace agreement to reverse the cycle of recurring conflict in the north. Mr. President, Council members will recall that the political transition in Mali was to conclude in March, in accordance with the initial 18 months timetable negotiated by ECOWAS after the August 2020 coup d'etat. The non-completion of the transition within the agreed timelines led ECOWAS to impose economic and financial sanctions last January, in addition to the individual measures decided a month earlier. The impasse has unfortunately persisted, exacerbating tensions between Mali and ECOWAS and adversely impacting Mali's relations with other international actors. As part of the local transition follow-up committee, which includes ECOWAS, the African Union, and MINUSMA, the mission has worked to arrive at an acceptable timeline for the holding of elections. The technical discussions that took place in February and March in Bamako paved the way for the return to Mali on 2 occasions of the ECOWAS mediator, former President Goodluck Jonathan of Nigeria. While some progress was made, with Mali requesting an additional 24 months to bring the transition to an end, this was deemed to still be too long at the ECOWAS Extraordinary Summit held in Accra on 25 March. The summit emphasized the urgency of reaching an agreement, considering the deteriorating security and humanitarian situation in the country. It endorsed the 12 to 16 months proposal put forward by the local follow-up committee as the basis for negotiations and mandated the mediator to return to Bamako to conclude a deal that would also ensure the gradual lifting of the sanctions imposed on Mali. No effort should be spared to achieve an agreement on the transition. This would not only make it possible to lift the sanctions, a critical measure in view of the prevailing humanitarian situation, but also create a more propitious environment for the pursuit of the other processes fundamental to Mali's stabilization. In the coming days, and in conjunction with the other members of the local follow-up committee, we will continue to engage the Malian authorities and other stakeholders to help in finding a solution to this impasse. Mr. President, in the past 12 months, I had the privilege of crisscrossing our area of deployment. I traveled on several occasions to the far north locations of Tessalit, Aguelhok, and Kidal, to the city of Tombouctou, as well as in Ber and Gunda, to the towns of Mopti, Douenza, Bandiagara, and Ségou in central Mali, and to the northeastern part of the country, from Gao to Ansongo to Menaka. Wherever I have been, I interacted extensively with local communities and officials. While in all these places, as well as in Bamako, there is a clear frustration at the prevailing insecurity and, understandably, criticism at the shortcomings of the actions taken over the past decade or so. What I also heard and noticed was a strong yearning for peace and better governance, which was also expressed during the Assise Nationale de la Fondation. Malian political stakeholders need to collectively internalize this yearning and live up to the expectations of their people. Mr. President, for the sake of the Malian people, MINUSMA, which embodies the international solidarity that Mali so deserves and is entitled to in its hour of need, should also be given all the resources it requires to close the gap that continues to exist between what the mission is mandated to do and what it can actually do. I thank you for your attention.
I thank Mr. Wan for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Bouare Bintou Fune Samake.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. President of the United Nations Security Council, members of the Security Council, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a pleasure for me to be addressing to you as part of the debriefing on the security situation in Mali. I'd like to thank you very much for this opportunity that you are giving to the Mali civil society through me to speak to you. My name is Madame Bouare Bintou Fure Samake. I have a legal training and I'm president of Women in Law Development in Africa and a former minister for the promotion of women, children and family. And the organization I represent is a Pan-African network to promote and protect the rights of women. This NGO signed a framework agreement with the Republic of Mali and brings within its umbrella 25 organizations and NGOs which deal with the promotion and protection of women's rights. We are a member of the Coalition on Gender and Climate Change and Security. And we have noted that women have been disproportionately hit by the ramifications of climate change. And that's why we put together this network of ours, which analyzes the traditional role of women as a consumer and manager of natural resources, and therefore climate change affects us significantly. Here I would like to underscore that we already have in Mali people who have been displaced because of climate change. And this coalition of ours brings together about 20 associations and NGOs throughout Mali. So what I'm going to tell you now is a compilation of viewpoints and analysis conducted by organizations and NGOs and individuals on the ground in the north, south, and center of Mali. Now, what is the current context in Mali? In addition to what was said by the special representative, let me say that I think that we are facing a multi-dimensional crisis, a political, security, cultural, identity, and institutional one. And all of this is taking place within an unstable environment and very difficult circumstances. Insecurity in Mali is multifaceted. There are many actors in it, but it had a very negative impact on the populations and on the rights protection organization. Here, I would like to recall some political and security developments recently taken place in Mali, and they need to be taken into account when decision-making on Mali comes. First of all, I'm referring to the national assizes and the 516 recommendations, including in them the extension of the transition period and the institutional and political reform as an expression of political will. Then there is the will to for change expressed by Mali authorities in cooperation on defense and security, which led to a divergence on position with international community in the wake of decision taken by authorities to diversify their cooperation to cover the gap at the center of the country in the wake of military cooperation with Russia. The withdrawal of Barkhane. This led to an apprehension on the part of the Western states because of the possible cooperation with Wagner, which the Mali authorities refute. On this, we need to add the non-availability of a timeline for elections, which again pitted Mali against European partners, not in particular France, but also its African friends and ECOWAS. As was stated, there were also intensive combats between FAMA and terrorist groups in the center and north of the country, and they have been increasing recently. But nonetheless, most of the people do support our armed forces in this work, and this is expressed basically at all levels. The civil society, the overwhelming majority, supports farmers' increasing power, but remains concerned by the rupture in international cooperation, in particular European, sub-regional, and the consequences of this break could have on civilians. These salient facts also, of course, had an impact on the work of the NGOs on the ground. So what are the difficulties that we are encountering? It is difficult to move around and to gain access to certain areas. It used to be possible, even during the period of insecurity, to be able to move with the support of MINUSMA, but because of restructuring within MINUSMA, it's become difficult. Then there is a limitation placed on certain fundamental freedoms, the freedom of expression, the freedom to move about, and a limitation on the access to justice. The freedom of expression in this security context is very difficult, and you can't say just anything, which means that very frequently that it's greatly limited. And today, people are speaking out on this. Also, we have to deal with the fact that there are few financial resources that we have and few partners. Partners basically left Mali. And in the most remote locations, it is no longer possible to find partners who could help local organizations. There's also a growing fundamentalist trends who undermined everything that have been done in the gender improvement areas. We also have to do with the fact that the policies and programs which could bring relief to population, especially women and children, are not being implemented. I can underscore this for you. We have our 1325 plan of action on women, peace and security. This program is much delayed and very few commitments undertaken there have been implemented. Also, women are becoming increasingly poor, especially women in rural areas. And this current context is very difficult for rural women who find it very difficult to trade or move about and have to deal with sexual violence. To this, we need to add a certain number of challenges in Mali. So what are these challenges? Let me quote some of them. The challenge here having to do with a common understanding of the MINUSMA mandate by the population. It's a 5-year mandate, and every time it's renewed, we ask for a program communicated the mandate so it can be explained. Next challenge is a consensual implementation of the agreement. We have been fighting women, that is, to sign a peace agreement and to implement mechanisms for its implementation. But we have to acknowledge now that women are not involved in the implementation mechanism. And I would like to here congratulate MISMA and thank them for their help when we tried to become involved in the peace agreement. 9 women from civil societies are members of a committee under the Peace and Reconciliation Agreement, which came out of the Algiers process. Another challenge is this. Every time ECOWAS comes for a meeting in Mali, we do hope, but every time such a meeting ends up in a failure. And it's a failure for everyone, and particularly women. For as long as there is no such agreement, the transition will not have begun. So we are being very patient, and we are looking forward with a great deal of worry and concern for the lifting of sanctions and the return to the constitutional order. Next, the exclusive nature of actors at the level of governance. Here, we have a law in my country according to which 30% of decision-making posts need to be allocated to a certain group. This does not exist. There is a combat that we have to deal with residual insecurity. Very frequently, we do not understand the terrorism-related insecurity in the same way as MINUSMA. We understand what the blue helmets do, but the majority of people that MINUSMA is there to combat terrorism. So I'm telling you that so that you understand how most of the people read the MINUSMA mandate and do not understand that MINUSMA mandate does not include anti-terrorism. Now, next challenge, combating impunity having to do with atrocities, war crimes, sexual violence in conflict, combating the gender-related inequality. We also have the challenge of putting to good use of our human resources. 60% of our population are young people and have no prospect of getting a job. We also have the natural resources. The sun, 44 degrees in Bamako today, wind, water, and land. Now, what do we need to do to overcome these challenges? We noticed that the worsened security context compounds the inequalities and widens the gap that we need to overcome in order to get the resources of the government, especially for women and children. So the civil society is planning to do the following: to coordinate the efforts made by the Security Council and the government of my country to promote a legal framework and resources conducive to building a security sector which is more inclusive, effective, transparent, sustainable, responsible, and put in the service of the people of Mali. Next, second, strengthen the gender language in the MINUSMA mandate in security sector reform, in particular by consulting the women in Mali before the mandate is renewed to ensure that their needs, their perspectives, and priorities are included in the mandate. In the current mandate, the gender issue has been taken up, but there have been no specific decision passed to make more specific and clarify this point that exists in the mandate already. Third point, we need to provide specific orientations and key actions to be undertaken by the mission to support what the government is doing to provide security services and make sure they're more sensitive to gender issues. We need to strengthen the women's empowerment programs, enabling them to overcome political, legal, institutional obstacles which make it difficult for them to be hired, retained, and promoted within the security sector. The low level, point number 5, the low level of representation of women in security sector affects the capacity of women to prevent violence, protect the human rights defenders, and provide security services adapted to all. We note that within the ranks, there are very few women. Within MINUSMA, in the humanitarian dimension of it. So, but when you see women there, this is reassuring for women to and assures them that some of their concern at least can be taken up by MINUSMA. Sixth point, we want to include climate change in MINUSMA's mandate as a key element which affects the security of people, specifically the security of women and children. Many of inter-community conflict has to do with a lack of resources, which in turn is related to climate change. So this is a key element that impacts the violence and conflicts. Seventh point, accountability mechanisms need to be put in place. They need to be effective to make sure that any kind of violence against women and underrepresented groups within the security institution is dealt with. Second, we need to transform into opportunities the potential that's up until now been viewed as a challenge, as, for example, wind, sun, water, space, and human resources. The young people in particular. I noticed that in Tessalit, MINUSMA placed solar mechanisms, and the children came out to play, and this helps people to change ideas and discuss the potential of our natural resources, especially in those localities where there's little electricity. Eighth point, we need to promote the upstream inclusion of women in security sector and the civil society organizations when they participate in peace agreements in Mali, in security policies nationally, and military expenditure. Women who are members of CSA have changed the course of discussions within those institutions. So I would say that the presence of women in decision-making institutions should be viewed as an opportunity and should be encouraged. 10th point, we need to undertake an assessment of the barriers that exists in the way of women's participation in national security sector, in particular in decision-making instances. I didn't put figures here because they're not necessarily reliable. We're lacking statistics, but the presence of women in these body would be a great opportunity. I thank you very much for your attention, and I am at your disposal for any clarifying follow-up question you may wish to put to me. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Samake for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, I would like to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary-General and Madame Samake for their briefings. France is extremely concerned by the situation in Mali. The violence is increasing against civilians in the center of the country, and that since the beginning of the year, in full impunity. We are seeing violations of human rights by elements of the Malian armed forces, accompanied by Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group. France, the European Union, and the countries of ECOWAS expressed their concerns last December when Wagner was deployed. I'm thinking particularly of the atrocities that led to the deaths of hundreds of civilians in the village of Moura. France would like to present its condolences to the families of the victims, and we ask that national and international investigations be opened up as soon as possible. This will make it possible to ensure that those responsible are brought to justice. Some of these crimes may constitute war crimes. France has taken note of the opening up of an inquiry by the public prosecutor in Mopti, and we will be closely following developments. It is essential that MINUSMA be able to carry out its own investigation, unhindered and in full independence, in order to establish the facts and report to this Council. Moreover, it's indispensable that MINUSMA use all of the means at its disposal to protect civilians. We call upon the Malian authorities to guarantee the freedom of movement of the mission. Fighting terrorism can only be successful if it is supported by the population, and in no case can it be used to justify indiscriminate violence against civilians. This only strengthens the hand of the terrorist groups. In this regard, we are concerned that the offensive being led since the beginning of the year by Islamic State in the Greater Sahara in the three-border area. This worsening of the security situation is happening at a time when the war conducted by Russia against Ukraine is further worsening an already critical food situation. We express our solidarity with the Malian people and the people of the Sahel. Mr. President, upcoming months will be crucial for Mali. France calls upon the transitional authorities to concentrate on three goals. The first is the implementation of the Algiers peace agreement. As a member of the international mediation, we believe that today this is still an adequate response to create sustainable, peaceful relations between the signatory armed groups and the authorities in Bamako. But no progress has been made now for several months. Fresh impetus is needed. The second goal would be to propose a specific strategy to deal with the crisis in the center and protect civilians. There again, we are expecting results. Finally, the last goal is to finalize the political transition and to return to constitutional order. France hopes that there will be a quick agreement between Mali and ECOWAS to organize elections as soon as possible. We support the efforts of ECOWAS, and we also condemn the serious attacks on public freedoms which further exacerbate the political climate. In order to achieve these three goals, MINUSMA is necessary. More than 30 countries contribute police and troops in extremely harsh conditions. We pay tribute to them, and we count upon the members of this council to renew the mandate of the mission in 3 months' time. We have ourselves decided to end our military involvement in Mali. That's a decision that we took in cooperation with the countries of the Sahel and neighboring countries and international partners. However, we plan to maintain our support to MINUSMA, and we will also continue with our humanitarian and development aid to directly benefit the Malian population. France will also remain committed in the fight against terrorism in the Sahel region, and we will examine strengthening our support to the countries of the Gulf of Guinea. We will be coming back to the Council soon with further details. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Mr. Al-Ghassim Wan, Special Representative of Secretary General and Head of MINUSMA, for his briefing on the recent developments in Mali and activities of MINUSMA in implementing its mandate. I also thank Madam Bouare Bintou Fone Samake, President of Women in Law and Development in Africa and Mali, for her insights. At the outset, allow me to express our deepest condolences to the families of 2 Egyptian peacekeepers who lost their lives in an attack on MINUSMA convoy in Mopti on 7 March, and to the government of Egypt. We also offer our condolences to the families of Malian security forces and civilians who were killed in several attacks during the reporting period. We strongly condemn these attacks and calls upon the Malian authorities to bring the perpetrators of such heinous crimes to justice. Terrorists have been increasingly using asymmetric means such as IEDs to target security forces and peacekeepers. MINUSMA has also recorded several instances of use of drones by hostile elements to watch activities and movements of peacekeepers. We reiterate our call for expeditious implementation of the provisions of Resolution 2589 on protecting the protectors, which was adopted by this Council last year, aimed at enhancing the accountability for crimes against UN peacekeepers. The security situation in Mali, particularly in northern and central regions, have remained grim as terrorists belonging to local affiliates of ISIL and Al-Qaeda, such as Islamic State in Greater Sahara and Jamaat Nasr al-Islam wal-Muslimin, continue to target civilian security forces and MINUSMA peacekeepers. The security challenges are likely to aggravate with the restructuring of international security presence in Mali. We have also noted the reported recent advances made by Malian armed forces against terrorists. Mr. President, the political and security situation in Mali has not seen any significant progress during the reported period. The stakeholders in Mali have yet not reached an agreement on the modalities of the transition or any meaningful time frame for the transition, despite continued engagement between the transition authorities of Mali and ECOWAS, which is playing a key role in this process. The multidimensional nature of challenges faced by Mali is rooted in long-standing imbalances in its constitutional, administrative, and security setup that have been largely left unaddressed for decades. For such a complex crisis, there cannot be a quick fix solution. Mali's challenges need to be addressed through a comprehensive approach, incorporating especially the implementation of the 2015 peace agreement, along with political electoral reforms and strengthening of security institutions to be able to provide security to Malian people from the growing threat of terrorism in the region. The international community may ignore terrorism in Mali and Sahel at its own peril. The genuine demands of national and regional authorities to undertake counter-offensive measures against arms and terrorist groups need to be addressed urgently. In this regard, noting the critical role of joint force of G5 Sahel, in coordination with MINUSMA in Mali and Sahel, we reiterate our call for robust support to joint force by the Council and the international community. A lasting solution can be achieved only through a Mali-owned and Mali-led process, and one which is seen as inclusive and representative by the people of Mali. We continue to encourage dialogue between Mali and the ECOWAS towards reaching an agreement at the earliest about an acceptable timeline for political transition and elections, leading to the return of the constitutional order. Such agreement will also set the scene for the lifting of sanctions against Mali, thus shielding the people of Mali from getting further impacted, as well as stabilizing Mali's relation with its neighbors. Mr. President, we commend the efforts of MINUSMA in assisting the Malian authorities. MINUSMA remains one of the most challenging peacekeeping missions. Therefore, it is important that MINUSMA is provided with adequate resources to implement its mandate. We also call for better coordination between MINUSMA and Malian armed forces. India continues to remain closely engaged with Mali in the sphere of development partnership, which gets reflected in critical infrastructure projects such as the ongoing construction of 393 kilometers of high-voltage double-circuit transmission line from Bamako, Mali's capital city, to Sikasso, the second-largest city of Mali. India is also assisting Mali in capacity-building programs such as scholarships for higher studies and professional training programs in India, including in defense and security-related areas. India remains steadfast in supporting the Malian people in their quest for lasting peace, security, and development. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of India for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
I thank you very much, Mr. President, and I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3 members of the Security Council, namely Kenya, Gabon, and my own country, Ghana. We welcome the report of the Secretary General and thank SRSG El Gassim I for his comprehensive briefing and insightful perspectives on the situation in Mali. SRSG, we commend you for your continuous engagement with the regional actors as well as the Malian authorities, and I appreciate your efforts in resolving the challenges in Mali. We also welcome the participation in this meeting of Boare Bintu Fune Samake, who spoke on behalf of the Women in Law and Development in Africa, WODAF, in Mali, and commend her for her unique perspectives. Mr. President, the people of Mali are yearning for peace in their country, and so are the member states in the region. A swift return to constitutional order is what we believe will give the elected government the legitimacy to lead the process of the comprehensive implementation of the peace accord. The A3 acknowledges the efforts of the international community in addressing the situation in Mali, and particularly notes the Secretary General's engagement with the transitional authorities and regional actors to adopt a consensual approach to dealing with the peace and security challenges in Mali, as well as the reforms set out by the Assise Nationale de la Refondation. We also acknowledge the critical role being played by MINUSMA in Mali. We pay tribute to the MINUSMA personnel who have lost their lives recently in the line of duty, and stand with the gallant personnel who continue to risk their lives for the cause of peace and stability in Mali. We welcome the mediation role of MINUSMA and the use of its good offices in supporting the Malian peace process, including the provision of training, technical, and humanitarian assistance. We look forward to the renewal of the MINUSMA's mandate in June, with elements that will enhance its logistical capabilities and effectiveness in dealing with the challenges in Mali. Mr. President, Despite ongoing efforts, the A3 continues to remain concerned about the complex and dire political, security, and humanitarian situation in Mali. We therefore wish to highlight the following 4 issues of concern. First, on the political front, we remain concerned by the slow progress of the implementation of the peace accord and the absence of a finalized timetable for the return to constitutional rule. We believe that the most sustainable way of addressing the situation in Mali is for the transitional authorities to adhere to the ECOWAS Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance, and by agreeing to a credible timetable for a swift return to constitutional order. We welcome the decision taken by the Authority of Heads of State and Government of ECOWAS at its extraordinary summit held in Accra, Ghana on Friday, 25th March 2022, urging the transitional authorities to adhere to the additional transitional period of 12 to 16 months, and note the ongoing discussions between the transitional authorities and the ECOWAS mediator to finalize the chronogram. Secondly, terrorism remains one of the greatest threats to stability in Mali and the region at large. We deplore the upsurge in extremist attacks, including the use of improvised explosive devices against civilians, the military, as well as MINUSMA personnel, which have exacerbated the security situation as evidenced in 103 security incidents recorded during the first 3 months of 2022, including 69 civilian deaths. While recognizing the investigations that are being conducted into circumstances leading to the firing of rockets close to elements of MINUSMA on 22nd March, we wish to encourage more engagement and information sharing between FARMA and MINUSMA to ensure that such incidents which undermine the safety of personnel are curtailed. We are also concerned by the impact of the uncontrolled exit of foreign fighters and mercenaries from Libya into the Sahel, which, coupled with the proliferation of arms, calls for a durable and holistic solution. The withdrawal of these extremist groups requires close monitoring and coordination to ensure a financed and effective program of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration in close coordination with neighboring states and relevant regional and sub-regional mechanisms. In light of these security concerns, we believe that it is important to urgently address the challenges placed in the way of TPCCs in rotating their personnel from the theater, including several West African TPCCs such as Senegal, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, and Ghana, who have troops in the theater beyond the recommended mission duration. This disturbing situation has moral, disciplinary, and operational implications for the troops and the mission, and we call on the Malian authorities to facilitate the required rotation without further delay. We also look forward to the outcome of the planned meetings of the Sahel Coalition and the joint strategic assessment of the situation in the Sahel towards a synergistic counter-terrorism network of the Sahel and coastal West Africa, including the Accra Initiative, the MNJTF, with requisite sustainable funding. Thirdly, the deteriorating human rights situation resulting from attacks by the extremist groups as well as intercommunal conflicts require greater attention. We condemn the abuses perpetrated against women, girls, and children, including abductions, arbitrary detention, sexual exploitation, and abuse. These attacks constitute a violation of international human rights law. We urge the transitional authorities of Mali to intensify their investigations to ensure that the perpetrators of these atrocities are arrested and swiftly prosecuted. We encourage additional support from Mali's Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission to enable it to execute its mandate effectively. We express concern over the deteriorating humanitarian situation characterized by forced displacements and the increase in the number of people who need humanitarian assistance. The A3 therefore endorses the Secretary General's calls for donors to respond more generously to the humanitarian appeal for Mali. The exacerbating impact of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic on the humanitarian situation also require careful attention. Fourthly, we welcome measures aimed at addressing the developmental challenges in Mali. In this regard, we commend the Peace-Building Commission for its intervention in Mali and believe that its role remains critical in addressing the underlying challenges in that country. We welcome the investment of $8.4 million United States dollars from the Peace Building Fund into initiatives targeting the youth, women, agricultural self-employment, and electoral violence reduction, and we encourage more of such efforts, including an increase in the contribution to the fund to enable it to achieve its mandate. Mr. President, in concluding, the A3 believes now more than ever that a quick return to constitutional rule, as well as the comprehensive implementation of the peace accord, is the surest way of bringing lasting peace to Mali. Time is of the essence, and the national political will and international support for such a course of action must be mobilized now. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Mr. El Ghassemwani for his comprehensive briefing. We also listened carefully to Ms. Bintou Samake, and we welcome the participation of His Excellency Ambassador Issa Konfuro, the permanent representative of Mali, in today's meeting. At the outset, the UAE affirms the need to intensify efforts to achieve stability and security in Mali, especially in light of the current deteriorating political and security situation. On the political front, we encourage intensifying national efforts to set a timetable for elections as soon as possible and in line with the aspirations of the people of Mali. In this context, we note the encouraging engagement currently taking place between the transitional authorities in Mali and the economic community of West African states, which includes an openness for dialogue, the efforts of the Special Envoy, Mr. Goodluck Jonathan, and those of the Joint Technical Team of ECOWAS, the African Union, and the United Nations. Additionally, the Security Council's support for national and regional efforts remains necessary at this critical juncture. We believe that long-term stability in Mali will also require a recommitment to the key tenets of the 2015 Agreement on Peace and Reconciliation, and to ensure its implementation by local authorities in cooperation with regional and international partners. Given the need to focus on the situation in central Mali, which is witnessing critical security developments, we look forward to finalizing the comprehensive political strategy to support stability in the region. We stress here the importance of promoting the effective, meaningful, and equal participation of women in all ongoing political processes, and we commend the efforts made in this regard, including to increase the number of women in the Peace Agreement Monitoring Committee and its subcommittees. Regarding the security situation, we express concerns about the threats that terrorist groups pose to the security and stability of Mali and the wider region. These groups continue their attempts to extend their control and expand the scope of their operations, despite national, regional, and international efforts to combat them. We once again condemn the targeting of peacekeepers by these groups, including the recent attack in Mopti, located in central Mali. These critical conditions, and rather this attack, has claimed the lives of Egyptian peacekeepers. We express our condolences to the Arab Republic of Egypt and the families of the victims. These critical conditions and developments affirm the need to intensify efforts to counter extremism and terrorism in line with the international law, including by ensuring more efficient implementation of the UN Integrated Strategy for the Sahel and by providing appropriate support to the G5 Sahel. Considering the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Mali, which has disproportionately affected women and children, the international community must continue to provide humanitarian aid and basic services for the 7.5 million people who are in urgent need of assistance. In this regard, we highlight that addressing the security threats associated with climate change in Mali would help ensure food and water security and contribute to achieving stability and development in Mali. In conclusion, the UAE affirms its continued support for development efforts in Mali and its path towards achieving prosperity and a sustainable peace. We also take this opportunity to express our support for MINUSMA and its efforts. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the UAE for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Of course, my delegation would like to thank the Special Representative Wayne and Madam Samake for their briefings, and We also welcome the representative of Mali to the meeting. Once again, we see the extreme complexity of the situation in Mali, its effects, generalized effects throughout the Sahel, and therefore the need for us to ask ourselves serious questions about the relevance of the approach that we have followed up until now in order to stabilize the country. I'd like to focus on three aspects that Mexico feels are essential in the current context. Firstly, we recognize the renewed efforts of the Malian security forces that they have deployed in recent months in order to fight the terrorist organizations. We're aware that the main cause of violence, which affects the civilian population and stands in the way of the deployment of the state throughout the country, is exactly the activity of these organizations, and that's why it continues to be essential to put an end to this scourge in order to achieve sustainable peace in Mali. Nevertheless, the legitimacy of the fight against extremism does not in any way exempt the state from its responsibilities and obligations in the area of human rights and in terms of respecting international humanitarian law. And that is why Mexico expresses our extreme concern with regard to the reports of civilian victims that it is believed were caused during the operation carried out recently in Mora. And we would call upon the authorities, transitional authorities, to cooperate closely with MINUSMA in order to determine exactly what happened. A rigorous, independent and objective investigation is necessary in order to strengthen the trust of the population in its own armed forces and to enable them to carry out their activities in full respect of the law. Secondly, we'd call upon the authorities to continue to work hand in hand with ECOWAS and with the African Union in order to achieve an agreement as soon as possible with regard to an electoral timetable that would put an end to this transition, which is getting longer by the day, and which would allow the multiple reforms that are outstanding to be carried out with the irreplaceable backing that is provided by the legitimacy of the popular vote. Mexico regrets that the actions of all political actors in the transition process, since there's no clear definition with regard to the elections, those actions have led to inevitably have led to serious delays in the implementation of the Algiers peace agreement, the follow-up bodies of which, as we've heard this morning, have not met for months. We must recall that there are still very many outstanding tasks in order to achieve the commitments agreed by the signatories. The decentralization of the civil service, for example, as well as the necessary process of disarmament, demobilization and reintegration of the former combatants. Thirdly, Mexico believes that in order to put an end to violence in Mali, we must address the precarious and very worrisome situation of economic development, put an end to the historic exclusion of certain groups in Malian society from the national political scene, and of course to counter impunity through a system of effective and independent justice. And in this latter regard, Mexico would like to reiterate our call to the Malian authorities to take into account the recommendations arising from the report of the International Investigative Commission that was presented in 2020. The work of this commission should be used in order to impart justice to the victims and break the cycle of violence that feeds into this conflict year by year. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mexico for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Special Representative Juan and Ms. Bintou Fuane Samake, for your briefings today. Ms. Samake, I appreciated your insightful emphasis on the critical role of women in the Algiers Accord and peace building in Mali. We fully endorse your call for the meaningful inclusion of women and women-led civil society organizations in the peace process. This should include younger women as appropriate. They are the rising generation. We also urge the transition government to make progress on the Algiers Accord and to ensure the full and safe participation of women throughout the elections process in Mali, including ensuring women are on the ballot, registered to vote, and have an opportunity to participate at all levels of the electoral process. Special Representative Juan, we welcome your efforts and those of MINUSMA's brave peacekeepers to fulfill this Council's broad and robust mandate to support the Algiers Accord between the Malian authorities and the signatory armed groups, to protect civilians, and to support the political transition. The United States expresses its deepest condolences and sympathy to the families and friends of the 3 Egyptian peacekeepers killed in attacks against MINUSMA last month. The United States joins others on this Council in strongly condemning all attacks against peacekeepers. And this includes the disinformation campaigns that have hindered MINUSMA's ability to carry out its Security Council mandate. As mandated by this Council, those involved in planning, directing, sponsoring, or conducting attacks against MINUSMA peacekeepers are those planning, directing, or committing acts in Mali that constitute human rights abuses or violations may be subject to Security Council sanctions. We call on the transition government to carry out transparent and credible investigations into attacks on peacekeepers or those who commit human rights abuses, and to hold those responsible accountable. Like others, the United States is deeply troubled by the developments in Mali since this Council last met on Mali on January 11th. First, the last 3 months have been marked by alarming accounts of human rights violations and abuses against civilians by terrorist armed groups and the Malian armed forces, with individuals linked to the Kremlin-backed Wagner Group. These reports must be investigated and those responsible held accountable. We are following closely the extremely disturbing accounts of hundreds of people killed last week in the village of Mora in the Mopti region of central Mali. The Malian people deserve answers to what happened in Mora the week of March 28th and what led to the gruesome execution-style killing of over 35 people on March 2nd in the Ségou region, and who is responsible. We note the Malian authorities have announced it will launch an investigation into the events in Mura. We urge the authorities also grant MINUSMA immediate access to both locations to conduct rigorous investigations, a task mandated by this very Council. This increase in reports of human rights abuses is exactly why the United States continues to warn countries against partnering with the Kremlin-linked Wagner Group. Wagner forces have been implicated in human rights abuses, including execution-style killings in the Central African Republic and elsewhere. Wagner Group forces will not bring peace to Mali and will divert resources away from the Malian armed forces' fight against terrorism and ultimately undermine the stability of the region. Malian authorities are also responsible for the actions of their security partners. Operations that inflict harm against civilians and abuse human rights in the name of counterterrorism will backfire. I agree with my French colleague that these actions can drive some to actually join or support violent extremist organizations instead of neutralizing the threat. Our second concern, the U.S. is deeply concerned by the Malian authorities' disregard for the status of forces agreement with MINUSMA and the restrictions on the mission's movements, especially in central Mali. The March 22nd incident involving the Malian forces firing 6 rockets near peacekeepers in eastern Mali is unacceptable. It is an affront to all those who serve in UN peacekeeping missions. The transition government is responsible for ensuring the safety, security, and the freedom of movement of UN personnel and assets. Restrictions limit MINUSMA's ability to anticipate, to deter, and effectively respond to threats to civilians, including from violent extremist groups, and will only lead to more attacks against civilians and Malian forces. These restrictions must end so MINUSMA can fulfill its mandate to protect civilians and foster peace. Third, ECOWAS and the transition government have yet to agree on an acceptable electoral timetable. We, along with fellow council members, welcomed ECOWAS's strong action in defense of democracy in January. We call for continued dialogue that produces an acceptable electoral calendar so the international community, but more importantly, the Malian people, know what to expect of the transition government. We share ECOWAS's deep disappointment with the lack of political will the transition government has shown toward organizing elections, as it committed to do following the August 2020 coup d'etat, which is now over 18 months ago. We urge the transition government to keep its pledge to the Malian people to return their country to democracy as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin also by thanking SRSG1 for briefing the Council. I commend the excellent work of MINUSMA. I also extend my thanks to Ms. Samake for bringing an important civil society perspective, and we support her call to include more gender language in the next mandate. At the outset, we would like to express deep concerns for the hundreds of people reported to have been killed during a counter-terrorism operation in Maura. We express our condolences to the families. We urge credible and impartial investigations by the Malian authorities on these unclear circumstances, the facilitation of independent investigation by MINUSMA, and immediate access of MINUSMA. Today's discussion is particularly timely, as March should have marked the close to the transition period and the return to constitutional order for Mali. Instead, we have witnessed a severe escalation in security threats, a dire humanitarian situation, and a dramatic shrinking of civic space, as the briefer just raised. Mali is also facing its worst food and nutrition crisis in decades, and the war in Ukraine is worsening the situation. The rapid expansion of terrorist attacks in Mali today presents a serious concern with armed Islamic group proliferation. The lack of state presence in creating a security vacuum conducive for non-state actors to further expand towards the south of Mali and wider coastal countries of the Gulf of Guinea. The recent Human Rights Watch reports documents disturbing attacks against civilians and local communities by the Malian army and armed groups. Albania strongly condemns the reported violence and calls for human rights and international humanitarian law to be upheld by all and under all circumstances. In this context, we remain deeply worried about the methods adopted by Wagner Group operating in Mali and in the wider region. As Security Council, we need to maintain a strong and articulated commitment in Mali, strengthening our support for the population in order to foster development and strengthen the resilience of local communities. However, it is the responsibility of the Malian authorities to take ownership and finalize a comprehensive political-led strategy to reach a durable solution to the conflict and restore democracy and stability. Albania calls on the Malian authorities to guarantee the freedom of movement and action of MINUSMA to allow the fulfillment of its mandate. We commend MINUSMA for facilitating progress in this challenging environment, including launching projects in cooperation with the local population, enabling thousands of people to have access to drinking water. And we look forward to the mandate's renewal in June. Mr. President, the political crisis and lack of commitment have contributed to severe delays in the implementation of the Algiers Accord. We echo the Secretary General's call to the Malian stakeholders to reach a consensus and build on the reforms articulated by the ASIS for the implementation of the agreement, focusing on those related to the holding of elections. In this regard, we stress the need for all activities to be gender responsive and build the capacity of women and girls. Albania stands with ECOWAS and the African Union and fully supports their efforts to overcome the political impasse in Mali and preserve the democratic model in the region. We urge the Malian authorities to engage constructively with ECOWAS, MINUSMA, and international partners in expediting the transition process and setting out a calendar for holding elections to return to constitutional order in a timely manner. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. I would also like to thank SRC1 for his reminder of the fundamental contribution that MINUSMA continues to bring to Mali and to the stability of the region. I also warmly thank Mrs. Samakaki for providing us with her real-world experiences, including on the nexus between gender, climate change, and security in Mali. We hope that the appointment of 15 more women to the Agreement Monitoring Committee can bring such aspects even higher on the agenda. President, let me now address the political transition. We are encouraged by the seemingly reduced distance in positions between Bamako and ECOWAS on the transitional timeline. ECOWAS should be commended for its persistence in pursuing dialogue. We urge Mali's transitional leaders to maintain a constructive dialogue with ECOWAS and to fulfill their promises of a swift return to constitutional order. President, 1 year and a half after the military took power by force in Mali, the security and humanitarian situations show few signs of improving. We remain especially concerned by the inability to protect Mali's youngest and most vulnerable, given the increasing reports of recruitment and use of children in armed conflict, closed schools, and the severe risk of acute malnutrition. And as we know, recent months have also seen a drastic increase in human rights violations and abuses. We underline the state's primary responsibility to ensure accountability and fight impunity, hereunder in relation to any external actor that the transitional authorities have hired, including the Wagner Group. We reiterate also the call from the Malian National Human Rights Commission and others for independent investigations of the horrific allegation of human rights violation and abuses in Mura. And let me be clear, in order to fulfill its mandate, MINUSMA must be given full access to investigate all allegations. President, I want to again pay tribute to every single person within MINUSMA for their professionalism and tireless efforts. We remember the brave peacekeepers and others who recently lost their lives in the service of peace in Mali. Let us not forget that part of the responsibility to ensure safety and security of peacekeepers falls on this Council. There are considerations we must pay extra attention to in the current changing security environments, including as Barkhane and Takuba starts to depart. But in addition, there are certain conditions and safeguards that only the host country can ensure. These responsibilities should not be taken lightly and must start with a fundamental respect for MINUSMA and its mandate. MINUSMA has the mandate and know-how to support the political transition, the implementation of the peace agreement, the respect for human rights, the rule of law, and protection of civilians. We therefore urge the transitional government to continue to engage constructively with the mission. In conclusion, President, during the critical time ahead, we ask the Secretary General to keep this Council closely informed about any added challenges or threats that may affect the MINUSMA operations and our peacekeepers in Mali. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, I thank Special Representative Wayne for his briefing. I've also listened carefully to the statement by Ms. Samake. We welcome the permanent representative of Mali to participate in this meeting. Recently, Mali's transitional authority has made great efforts to improve the security situation and ease the humanitarian crisis, but it also faces multiple challenges. The international community should bear in mind the overall situation of maintaining regional stability, actively provide help and support, and do more things that are conducive to peace and stability in Mali. In connection with the SG's report, I would like to make the following observations. First, recently, the ECOWAS, the AU, and the Malian Transitional Authority have been in continuous communication on the issues of political transition, striving to narrow their differences. China commends these efforts and hopes that parties will reach an agreement as soon as possible to push the political process forward on the right track. Meanwhile, making arrangements for the transitional period and general election is only the first step. The key is to help Mali achieve long-term security and stability. The international community should support the Transitional Authority of Mali in accordance with the consensus reached at the National Reconstruction Conference to advance the reform process, implement the peace agreement, formulate and implement a comprehensive strategy for the central region, and help Mali embark on the development path that suits its national conditions. Second, Mali is an important force in counterterrorism operations in the Sahel region. Recently, the Mali government has carried out a series of counterterrorism military operations in the central and northern regions, which have severely crippled terrorists and extremist forces, ensure the safety of local people, and help the displaced people return to their homes, which is conducive to the stability and development of these regions. These efforts should be acknowledged. Meanwhile, terrorist forces are still entrenched in the central and northern regions, and the withdrawal of foreign military forces also provides them with an opportunity to take advantage of the chaos and seek expansion. There should be no slack in the fight against terrorism. We should continue to support the Malian government's efforts to combat terrorism and maintain stability, help it step up capacity building, and respect its right to international security cooperation. China has noted the concerns in some media reports about human rights violations in the counterterrorism operations in the Mural region. The Malian side have already made clarifications, emphasizing that relevant actions were aimed at rescuing local people and that they have always respected human rights and were willing to conduct relevant investigations. China hopes that all sides will exercise restraint and avoid making groundless accusations before any conclusion is reached by the investigation. Third, economic and humanitarian situation in Mali is daunting. Foreign trade, employment, production, and investment have declined to varying degrees. 42.7% of Malian people live in extreme poverty. 7.5 million people need humanitarian assistance, and 960,000 children under the age of 5 are suffering from severe malnutrition. The international community cannot forget about the difficulties faced by African countries such as Mali, and African development issues should not be marginalized. As a good friend of African countries, China will continue to stand by the African countries, accelerate the implementation of the Global Development Initiative and the outcomes of the Forum on China and Africa Cooperation, and continue to support Mali and other African countries in their economic recovery. Fourth, the security risks faced by MINUSMA have continued unabated. It is heartbreaking that 2 Egyptian peacekeepers were killed in an attack last month. IED is one of the major causes of casualties among MINUSMA peacekeepers. The Secretariat should take concrete measures in light of the relevant recommendations of the SG's independent strategic assessment. It is essential to have an in-depth assessment of the impact of the withdrawal of foreign military forces on the work of MINUSMA and to identify weak links in medical support, intelligence gathering, and security so as to ensure that MINUSMA is not affected in the implementation of its mandate and to ensure the safety of peacekeepers. On March the 22nd, a security incident occurred between the Malian security forces and MINUSMA. Fortunately, there was no casualty. China notes that both sides have launched investigations and hopes that both sides will work together to find a proper solution based on the findings of the investigations so as to prevent the reoccurrence of similar incidents in future. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, President, and I would like to thank SRSG Juan for his briefing this morning and for MINUSMA's continued work in an increasingly challenging environment. The mission's work on the protection of civilians and human rights monitoring and reporting has never been more vital. I would also like to extend my thanks to ECOWAS and the African Union for their continued work in pursuit of lasting peace and stability in Mali. I welcome, President, also Ms. Samake's presence here as a strong advocate for women in Mali and thank her for her important and informative briefing. As we've heard, by almost every metric, the situation in Mali continues to deteriorate at an alarming rate. We are deeply disturbed by the increasing reports of killings of civilians, human rights violations and abuses, and violations of international humanitarian law. Unrest and humanitarian need, including an unprecedented food crisis, continues to grow as the transition process and implementation of the peace agreement remain stalled. President, the reports of a massacre in the village of Mora last week following a counter-terrorism operation by the Malian armed forces are frankly horrifying. We offer our sincere condolences to the families of those killed. There must be a thorough and transparent investigation into these allegations. We note the intention of the public prosecutor of the Mopti military court to open an investigation. Nonetheless, MINUSMA must be granted unfettered, timely and safe access to Mora to conduct a full investigation and to take action to ensure the protection of civilians. Those responsible for these and other violations and abuses must be brought to justice, regardless of affiliation or nationality. As others have said, human rights violations serve only to drive radicalisation and contribute to the growth of terrorism and violent extremism. We call on the Malian authorities to tackle impunity and to ensure that measures taken to combat terrorism comply with international law. We are also increasingly concerned about reports of the presence of the Wagner Group in Mali. Their presence can only serve to fuel existing tensions, increase instability and violence, and impede MINUSMA's efforts to protect civilians and provide support to the Malian armed forces. We are also seriously concerned by the increased number of civilian casualties as a result of attacks by armed extremist groups in the tri-border area and welcome the investigation of these attacks by MINUSMA. President, there can be no doubt that civilians, including children, are bearing the brunt of sustained political tensions and insecurity in Mali. The 57% increase in violations against children documented in the Secretary-General's report is simply unconscionable. It is also deeply troubling that violations and abuses against women and girls, including conflict-related sexual violence, persist at a high rate and continue to be underreported. We urge holistic and integrated action to address gender equality, and in particular to address the stigma of gender and sexual and gender-based violence and deliver justice to survivors. President, we condemn the ongoing and totally unacceptable attacks against peacekeepers by all parties. MINUSMA must be allowed to do its job to protect the Malian people. We call on the authorities to create a protective environment for civilians and MINUSMA, including by ensuring that all security actors operating on Malian territory respect the Status of Forces Agreement and ensure the safety and security of UN personnel. President, we are convinced that the 2015 peace agreement remains a critical framework for ensuring lasting peace and stability in Mali. We are concerned at the slow progress of implementation of the agreement and urge all parties to accelerate action in this regard. Finally, we call on the transitional authorities to agree an acceptable timeline for the return to constitutional order and the holding of elections. Immediate action must be taken on essential reforms to facilitate to democratic governance and lay the foundations to guide the long-term stability and sustainable development that the Malian people so richly deserve. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ireland for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Russia.
Господин председатель.
Mr. President, we are grateful to the Special Representative El-Ghassim for the briefing on the MINUSMA mission and the situation in the country. We listened very carefully to Bouwari Samaki, and we welcome the participation of the Mali PR in this meeting. We are convinced that in order to overcome the existing challenges will only be possible for the Malians provided there is internal political stability in the country. And we can see that the transition authorities very seriously intend to gradually resolve the accumulated issues. Restoring the constitutional order is, of course, one of the priority issues. And during the reporting period, we have heard the Malian authorities repeat that Bamako is committed to implementing this. The fact that the Malian authorities conduct a broad national process to prepare for the elections, and the fact that they have created an extended working group on this, and also they established a dialogue group so as to relaunch negotiations with the AU and ECOWAS, all of this shows that they have a constructive approach and that the current authorities do not have a hidden agenda. We do hope that in the near future, the negotiations between Bamako and ECOWAS will bear fruit. And we call upon both sides to continue dialogue and the mediators to continue making their efforts. We share the concern expressed by the Malian authorities when they were talking about the worsening situation in the northern areas of the countries, where because of the French military withdrawal, there's now a vacuum in the security area. We hear from Bamako that just like as was the case in the fall last year, the decision to fully withdraw Barkhane was made without consultations with the Mali side, and this is a violation of bilateral agreements, and we think that this is extremely irresponsible. We also share the assessments we have in the Secretary General's report when he talks about the negative consequences of actions by France and its EU partners for the implementation of the MINUSMA mandate, in particular when it comes to the risk it brings for the security of peacekeepers. It is also not clear what the withdrawal of Barkhane and Takuba will, what kind of impact it will have on combat readiness for the joint Sahel 5 forces, who are to be in the avant-garde of fighting terrorism in the Saharan Sahel. At the same time, I would like to recall that what is happening in Mali is a victim of your intervention in Libya in 2011. It is since then that the region has become an area of active banditism and terrorism. The fact that in 2013 you decided to extend assistance is certainly something that merits respect. But if you look at the outcome of this assistance of yours, then you can see that up to 2021 the situation had not been improving. And now, without having accomplished anything and using a trumped-up pretext, you are dropping Mali, the country which we know is a key country for stability and security in that part of Africa. Under the conditions when the Malians basically are left alone and facing cross-border challenges, serious ones, the transition authorities are trying to help their people on their own and also through interaction with partners and organizations from other countries. The Malian authorities have the sovereign right to decide who they want to work with. We welcome the intensification of counter-terrorism operations by the Malian armed forces and the successes in this regard, as a result of which a number of settlements in the center of the country have been freed. We also pay tribute to the Malian armed forces and express condolences to the families of those who perished, both the military and civilians, and of course the UN peacekeepers. We call upon everyone to respect the memory of all victims of terrorism. At the same time, we note that the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Mali are committed to human rights, international humanitarian law, and that Bamako is making efforts to investigate those incidences where human rights are being violated. The information campaign about the so-called Russian mercenaries we view as part of some kind of a sordid geopolitical game. Mr. President, We would like to point out that the Russian-Mali cooperation is something that has that hails back a long time ago. Russia has been extending assistance to Mali on the basis of bilateral agreements. We work to make sure that we increase their combat readiness, that we train their military and law enforcement. Currently, we have about 200 military and 9 policemen who are being trained in Russia. We are convinced that the stabilization of Mali is not being helped by the regional sanctions imposed on it or by the restrictions put on by a number of Western countries. They can only compound the already very difficult situation, not to mention the fact that they worsen the daily life of ordinary Malians, not just Malians, but also the people in other countries in the region. Under these conditions, Bamako and its neighbors will find it ever more difficult to deal with the challenges of the country, chief among them terrorism. We have heard today yet once again accusations against Russia stating that we are supposedly provoking famine in the Sahel. Let me recall that some time ago, climate was the culprit responsible for everything. Now it's Russia. Mali, at the same time, has numerous sanctions levied on it. The borders are closed. The trade routes are blocked. The people are suffering, the people of the entire region. They do not have their most basic income. But please take a look at the slogans that the ordinary people come out when they come out in protest. They do mention Russia, but not at all in the way that Western countries would like to see. In this regard, I would like to yet once again note that the consequences of unprecedented anti-Russian sanctions, which resulted to the disruption of all logistical and financial chains and links in the world, show to most countries in the world, including the countries in Africa, how important it is to defend your own political independence and your own financial capacities to overcome the colonial inheritance and to give up on the remaining colonial mechanisms. In conclusion, I would like to say that Russia will continue extending support to Malians, including through collective efforts to help stabilize the situation in the country. At the same time, we ask Bamako to have a balanced approach to crisis settlement. In the original version of my statement, I was going to say that we expect that the traditional partners of Mali will find an opportunity to reject the logic of being sermonizing and superior and use the language of sanction, and within the framework of respectful dialogue with Bamako, will find a way of overcoming differences. But having heard the discussions today, I'm compelled to admit that this will probably not something that will happen, and the appeal for an equitable, mutually beneficial and respectful cooperation is something that the Western countries will not heed yet once again. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Russia for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, let me thank SRSG1 and Ms. Samake for their briefings and welcome the presence of the permanent representative of Mali to this meeting. Recent Secretary General's reports on the situation in Mali document a worrying dynamic, the persistence of high levels of violence and limited progress in the political process. It is painful to note that this trend was accentuated in the period covered by the latest report. Of particular concern are accounts of serious human rights violations and the significant increase in the number of grave violations against children. Brazil understands the seriousness of the terrorist threat in the Sahel and supports the efforts of the Malian transitional authorities in coordination with the G5 Sahel Joint Force in the fight against terrorist groups. but the human rights of the Malian population must not be compromised in the name of the fight against terrorism. We take note of the decision by the Malian transitional authorities to launch an investigation into reports of summary executions of civilians in Moura, allegedly carried out by members of the Malian armed forces with the support of foreign fighters. If the allegations are confirmed, it is essential that those involved answer for their actions in order to ensure that abuses do not happen again. It is also important to note that the presence of foreign mercenaries on the ground is not a solution, much less a sustainable solution to the security situation, and might increase the risk of human rights violations, illegal exploitation of natural resources, and political instability, as observed in crises elsewhere. Mr. President, the current level of violence is directly related to the near paralysis in the implementation of the peace agreement, the postponement of the return to the constitutional framework, and the absence of an acceptable timeframe for elections threaten the credibility of the reconciliation process. In a scenario that becomes more complex with the presence of terrorist groups and signs of a worsening humanitarian situation. We encourage the transitional authorities and other political forces in Mali to fulfill their commitments in the peace agreement and accelerate the implementation of its provisions, such as the reintegration of former combatants. We also support the holding of elections within an acceptable and realistic timeframe, so that the transitional period does not last longer than necessary. Mr. President, the violence of recent weeks and the stagnation of the political process must not make us lose sight of the root causes of the conflict. The eventual success of stabilization and reconciliation efforts depends on addressing Mali's development needs, especially in the north and the center of the country. In this sense, Brazil urges the Malian transitional authorities to finalize the comprehensive, politically led strategy for the center and highlights the importance of expediting progress on the development zone of the northern regions of Mali. We urge the transitional authorities to collaborate with ECOWAS so that sanctions imposed in response to the postponement of the elections may be lifted in the near future. Mali is already under the negative impact of other conflicts on food prices, and there is a real risk that the current situation will turn into a humanitarian catastrophe. We must highlight the plight of the more than 960,000 children under the age of 5 at risk of acute malnutrition. Mr. President, in June, the Council will discuss the renewal of MINUSMA's mandate. Recent developments, which include the withdrawal of troops from Operation Barkhane and the Takuba Task Force, have significantly altered the conditions on the ground. Brazil considers it's essential to ensure that MINUSMA has the necessary resources to support the implementation of the peace agreement and the political transition, as well as to protect civilians and support the restoration of the Malian state authority in the center. Finally, Mr. President, Brazil welcomes MINUSMA's initiatives to improve communication with the Malian population about its mandate and activities. MINUSMA's strategic communications capabilities should be strengthened in order to maintain the mission's ability to achieve its political, protection, and humanitarian goals. Brazil welcomes the commitment of the Secretary-General to mainstream strategic communications into both planning and day-to-day operational decisions of missions, including MINUSMA, as stated in its Action for Peacekeeping Plus plan. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Kingdom. I want to start by thanking SRSG1 for his remarks today, and through him, pay tribute to all members of MINUSMA, whether civilians or in uniform, serving the UN in Mali. I also want to thank Madame Samake for her briefing. Her words are a clear reminder of the invaluable contribution women make, including in societies affected by conflict and poverty. We must ensure the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in the pursuit of lasting peace. I also welcome the representative of Mali to our meeting. Like other Council members, the United Kingdom is horrified by reports indicating that hundreds of people were killed in Mora last week, following a counter-terrorism operation carried out by the Malian armed forces with the alleged involvement of the Wagner Group. This needs an urgent, transparent, and impartial investigation to bring those responsible to justice. The government must grant MINUSMA full access to Mora without further delay. The latest reports from Mora follow a clear trend in a surge of human rights abuses since the deployment of the Wagner Group to Mali. As also highlighted in the deeply concerning Human Rights Watch report in March. We know that, as of early 2022, around 1,000 Russian mercenary personnel have been stationed across Mali. Just as the presence of Russian mercenaries drove an increase in human rights violations and abuses in the Central African Republic last year, we fear we are now seeing the same in Mali. This underlines the extent of Russia's malign activity globally, which serves to damage efforts to address peace and security in contexts beyond Ukraine. With the threat to communities in Mali growing, it is vital that MINUSMA is able to carry out its human rights tasks. We thank MINUSMA for their continued efforts to investigate, document, and report on all allegations. We encourage the publication of human rights findings in full and at the earliest opportunity. We note with concern the increasing restrictions imposed by the Malian authorities on MINUSMA operations. MINUSMA's freedom of movement and its status of forces agreement must be respected. Only last month, UK peacekeepers came under fire from a Malian armed forces helicopter. We look forward to receiving the outcome of the UN's investigation into this concerning incident as soon as possible. We were deeply saddened to learn that 3 Egyptian peacekeepers were killed last month in IED attacks. On behalf of the UK, I would like to extend my deepest sympathies. On the political transition, the United Kingdom continues to support ECOWAS's dialogue with the Malian authorities on a revised timeline for elections, so that sanctions can gradually be lifted and attention turned towards electoral preparations. We recognise the sincere desire of many Malians for substantive reform. However, we believe it is only through elections and a return to constitutional democratic rule that long-term reform can be driven forward with the support of partners. The United Kingdom remains committed to supporting those most in need in Mali, and we provided more than $16 million in humanitarian aid in 2021. However, the mobilisation of resource by the international community must also be accompanied by unimpeded, safe and sustained humanitarian access, including in those areas that are hardest to reach. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mali.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, the government of Mali takes note of the Secretary General's report, and I would like to thank my brother, Mr. El-Ghassim, head of MINUSMA. I thank him for his presentation. I would like to right now, on behalf of the government of Mali, would like to react to the report of the Secretary General and the comments that you made that I listened to very carefully. Let me start by the need to return to the constitutional order in Mali, which was invoked by the Secretary General in his report and also by many members of the Security Council as well. I'm sure you noticed that this issue is amongst the priority of the transitional government because the Malians are attached to democracy. However, we should not lose sight of the fact that the political and institutional instability chronic in Mali results from poorly organized elections and poor governments. And that's why the transition government wants to organize major reforms so as to have a stability of institutions, a better future for our people. Also, We need to create the minimal security conditions in order to be able to have elections. The government remains involved in the dialogue with ECOWAS on this, and this includes the issue of the length of the transition. Furthermore, the government of Mali asks for an immediate lifting of unfair, illegal, illegitimate, and inhumane sanctions imposed by CEDEAO, by ECOWAS, and UMOA. I recall the order issued on the 24th of March 2022 here by the Court of Justice of UMO. They ordered the suspension of the execution of sanctions imposed by the Conference of Heads of States and Governments. The government notes with regret that despite the double notification of this notification by Mali and by the court, despite the human and social impact the sanctions have on the population, the Commission and the Conference of Heads of State have declined to execute this order, which, whereas it is for immediate execution and not subject to appeal. So this to us looks like a double standard policy motivated by the desire to suffocate the people of Mali. And this is influenced by the agendas and external pressure, thinly veiled, of those who try to punish our people for our political choice and who are trying to organize a regime change. Madam President, members of the Council, on the security area, the government continue efforts to recruit, train, and equip our defense and security forces so as to improve their operational capacities. And this gives us very encouraging results on the ground. Since December 2021, the defense and security forces have been continuing their vast offensives throughout the country, and they inflicted heavy losses on the extremist groups, including terrorist chiefs. This enabled us to destroy several terrorist bases, several apprehensions took place, and a high quantity of materiel was recuperated. And this has already increased the sentiment of security, and as a result, we have more than 80,000 people returning to their homes. We intend to continue here. Our goal is to protect our people and their goods and gradually reestablish the authority throughout the country, provide administrative, social, basic services throughout the country. And this will help create the conditions that are needed to have inclusive and credible elections. And here I would like to thank all of the partners who are helping Mali in implementing this objective. Here I would also like to react to what was said by certain members of the councils who accuse, without any basis, the government of Mali of using private security companies, and I heard this last time. Let me repeat this here, and to do it forcefully. We undertook no commitment of this nature. We have a fruitful cooperation relation with Russia, state-to-state relation, and have been doing so since 1960. And it is a result of this cooperation with Russia that Mali continues procuring military material we need for our security. And it is a result of this cooperation that the trainers and instructors from Russia are in Mali to advise and train our military on how to use the material we acquired from the Russian Federation. Having said this, we are available to cooperate with all of our traditional partners. We're open to each of our partners when they want to help us restore peace and security and respect the sovereignty, national unity, and territorial integrity of Mali. Mr. President, members of the Council, you also spoke of the need to accelerate the implementation of the Peace and Reconciliation Agreement in Mali, the one that came out of Algiers. I would like to underscore how committed we are to implementing this, to do it diligently and intelligently. This commitment of the government was reconfirmed by the National Assizes of Refondation in December 2021, which recommended a new constitution establishing establishing a Senate and accelerate the process of decentralization and dialogue. Here, once again, I would like to welcome the active role played by Algeria and international mediation. Now, on women's participation in the peace process, here I'm happy to be able to inform you that the government communicated a list of 15 additional women who are to become part of the follow-up committee and its subcommittees. Despite the far-reaching specific proposals from the government, the DDR process, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, and reinsertion within the agreement is encountering some difficulties. Here, the government is awaiting a list of signatory movements so that we can start with the process of the reinsertion of former combatants. Development issues under the agreement. And contrary to what is said by the Secretary General, we are committed to the development of regions in the north. An illustration, we have 16 projects that we have on this on the 21st October. Despite the difficult situation we find ourselves as a result of economic and financial blockade by ECOWAS and UMOA. So I launch an appeal to all partners of Mali to help us with funding the strategy in the north. The Secretary General and several members of Security Council are concerned by the situation with human rights in Mali. I would like to underscore that the government is very committed to respect and making sure that human rights are respected by the national and international forces in line with the historic values we've had since 1236, published by Emperor Sudindaka Keita. In January 2012, Mali was called an example when it comes to the respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms. The complex crisis that we have been in for about 10 years and the loss of control of some parts of a national territory, unfortunately, results in a situation where human rights are not abided by. However, there is no determined decision by the national authorities to allow impunity when it comes to proven human rights violations. Our justice system is systematically seized every time there is a human rights violation reported. A special court of assizes deals with terrorism and serious violations of human rights. They sat in Bamako in October 2021. Before that, the court of assizes in Moptu found guilty on the 30th June 2021 12 individuals accused of attacks in Koulogon-Peul in the circle of Bankas, which resulted in the death of 37 people. This shows you the commitment of the government of Mali, despite our many challenges, to spare no effort so as to combat impunity. Other assizes sessions will take place in 2022 to provide appropriate follow-up to many investigations and procedures underway, and this is in line with the laws of my country. It is true, nonetheless, that the security conditions on the ground, the absence of competent public services in certain areas, and the lack of means and expertise in certain areas is not conducive to the rapid conclusion of open proceedings. So I am pleading for a strengthened international cooperation with Mali so as to help us rise to the challenges in this area and help us with training, equipment, expertise, and proper funding. The government of Mali reiterates its appeal to the partners to help us reestablish the authority of state throughout the country. This is an essential precondition to improve the human rights situation in the country. Now, on the military situations, ongoing military situations in Mura, at 17 kilometers northeast of Kwakuru, in the Jenis Circle, region of Mopti. Here, I would like to specify that this was done in the wake of very specific intelligence, where we localized a meeting amongst several Katibats. As a result of this, we neutralized 203 combatants from armed terrorist groups. After the first hearings by the gendarmerie, the people interrogated were transferred to a specialized judiciary unit, and they are to investigate terrorist cases. Yesterday, on the 6th of April, the Prime Minister, President of Tabital Pulaku, Association of the Community Puli, underscored that Mura was a sanctuary for terrorist and unequivocally said that allegations against the armed forces were false. So I would like to say that the respect of human rights, international humanitarian laws, is a priority for our armed and security forces. The same applies to opening an investigation every time there is an allegation against our armed forces. Now, as regards the events in Mura and in the wake of allegations of atrocities against civilians from 23rd to 31st March 2022 in that area, the military prosecutor decided to open an investigation by the National Gendarmerie to have an in-depth investigation and shed light on these allegations, despite the fact that the military operations there are underway. A judiciary transport will be conducted to Mura by the military prosecutor, who will be also acting as a judiciary police. He will be accompanied by a coroner and a technical scientific team and investigators, and the public opinion will be regularly informed about the developments of these investigations, and the final outcome will be made public as well. As we await the conclusions of these investigations, we call on all parties to exercise restraint, to not qualify this as a massacre, not to use allegations and other accusations which are baseless against our armed forces. We are concerned by the deterioration of humanitarian situation in Mali. It is further compounded by the very poor rain season last year, and also by the negative impact of ECOWAS sanctions on our people and insecurity in the central area where food production takes place. In order to alleviate the suffering, the government works together with bilateral and multilateral partners to provide assistance to our people in a vulnerable situation. Mr. President, members of the Council, to conclude, I would like to say that the crisis in Mali, which has a major impact on the stability of all of the West Africa and the Sahel, remains difficult and complex. Its lasting solution is the main responsibility of the Malian people. The government of Mali remains determined to play fully its role to ensure the return of peace and stability throughout the country by using our political security, socioeconomic development tools, as well as justice and reconciliation. However, the implementation of all of this far-reaching work requires the understanding and accompaniment by all of our partners, and that is why I would like to here ask for the understanding of our partners and ask for an immediate lifting of the sanctions which is hinting an already fragile country as a result of a political, security, economic, and health crisis, especially at the time where our armed forces are gaining in confidence and bringing in victories. The people and the government of Mali reiterate their appreciation and thanks to the enormous contribution of the United Nations to my country, in particular through MINUSMA. I pay tribute to the memory of all of the victims of the crisis, civilian and military, foreigners and Malians who have perished in Mali. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank the representative of Mali for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers, so I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.